This is the Business of Apps podcast, bringing you actionable insights from the leaders of the global app industry and the world's fastest growing apps. You can find more app news, data and analysis over at businessofapps.com.
Welcome to the Business of Apps podcast. On this show, we invite app industry professionals to cover various topics. We promise to do our best to keep it both insightful but brief. In this episode, we have Levi Matkins, CEO at LifeStreet. Levi, welcome to the Business of Apps podcast.
Hey, Art. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you for coming. Okay. In the heart of any sustainable business is knowing how much money you actually make with each client. When you launch a mobile app project, you hope to sustain this business for years to come, not just months or weeks, right? How do you achieve that? For starters, you absolutely need to know what revenue each of your app users generate for you. Here comes the notion we're going to spend the next half an hour or so, LTV, aka lifetime value. But first, before dissecting the notion of LTV in mobile, let's talk about you, Levi. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I've got close to 20 years now in digital advertising, about half of that in mobile. Kind of got my start in the industry co-founding a company with my brother while I was still in college. Ended up being early buyers of Google AdWords inventory. Did that for about 5 years, and I've kind of had roles at a bunch of different companies, from really small to really big. I sold ads at MySpace for a while, where I got to say we serve 1 in every 7 ad on the internet, and then landed at LifeStreet about 9 years ago. On a personal note, I enjoy reading a bunch and pretty much try to get outside whenever possible. Skiing and surfing are kind of 2 of my favorite activities right now.
20 years to mobile digital advertising. That's the entire universe, because I still can remember what was happening 20 years ago when I was doing a search engine optimization and paid a search for some obscure websites back then. Boy, the world was really different back then 20 years ago.
It sure was.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me about LifeStreet. What do you guys do?
Sure. So LifeStreet's a programmatic marketing platform for app developers. Essentially, that's a fancy way of saying a mobile performance DSP. LifeStreet got its start, I think, over 15 years ago now, and has been all about testing, optimization, and ROAS maximization, and that continues to this day. We're laser focused on driving ROI positive media buys, specifically for the world's largest app developers, and primarily for game developers. Over the last 6 or so years, we've been buying exclusively programmatically, and just about 2 months ago released our new platform, Nero, which we're super excited about.
Oh, that's great. 15 years. That's so 2022. So 20 pretty much from the inception of mobile, like from the early days of iPhone, from those days.
Yeah, we actually got our start helping Facebook app developers kind of monetize and acquire users.
Oh, nice. Okay, let's cover the basics. Let's define the term LTV, and how's it different from another acronym beloved by app marketers, ROAS?
Sure. So starting with LTV, you said it earlier, it's lifetime value. So generally speaking, it's a measurement of how much money a user will generate for an app in a given amount of time. As the name suggests, typically that's the lifetime. Main components that go into LTV are some components trying to capture all the monetization. So that'd be things like in-app purchases, subscription revenue, or ad revenue from showing users ad impressions. And then another component of time or retention. There's different ways to express that via churn or kind of user retention. And then lastly is virality. So how many additional users are referred to the app from that initial user. A common formula ignoring virality is average revenue per user. So that captures the monetization rate times 1 over your churn rate. And then getting into ROAS. ROAS is something we're super familiar with, and that's return on ad spend. And that's essentially measuring, if I spend $100 today, how much am I getting back on that $100? And for app marketers, what they end up doing is using that LTV formula to try and calculate a payback period of when they expect to make their money back, and then calculate sort of waypoints along the way to see how they're performing against that. So an LTV will help inform an advertiser's targets, which might be something like, hey, I need to make 10% of my ad spend back within the first 7 days, because my formula suggests that, after 365 days, I'll have made the entirety of my money back, and everything beyond that will be profitable.
Yeah, and an LTV term, I always was puzzled by the part life of a app user. For how many years he or she is going to use the app till she or she retires? Like we're calculating based on on a time scale of months and years at this point, but I wonder would it be possible to calculate LTV for in a decade from now if if I'll be able to return a user for so many years. But yeah, it's kind of interesting perspective in relation to lifetime value.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you think of, titles like Candy Crush that are still going strong, over
Amazing.
half a decade later.
Yeah, amazing that it's still popular. People still love these colors, bright colors on the screen. Now, from both strategical sorry, let's talk about the importance of LTV in general. So we've said what it means, but let's stress on the significance of this notion for app marketers. Why do we measure it? Is it possible to just don't pay attention to LTV and keep rolling with your app business?
It's certainly possible. I can't think of a single successful app developer that does that. I mean, if you think about it, it's critical for your business. I mean, it's essentially how much you make from a user. Having a good LTV in an app is the difference between success and failure. And kind of as we're saying, if you can't improve what you don't measure, so it's critical to track and measure LTV. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but it is required to come up with that payback curve for your marketing campaigns, which does answer those questions of, if I have made X amount of money back at a particular point in time, how much will I make over the lifetime of that app? It's certainly, as we've kind of talked about, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I think, it's become such a competitive space right now that it's not really possible just to hope for the best when it comes to LTV. And it's really true that only those developers with the most competitive LTVs are really able to scale their marketing campaigns.
Want to improve your app marketing skills? Know how to fight back mobile fraud? Or how to launch an influencer marketing campaign? You've got it all at the Business of Apps Insights. Opinion, how-tos, thought leadership, and analysis from global app and social media industry. Visit our Insights section at businessofapps.com/insights/podcast. And now, back to the show.
Now, is it possible, look, what would be the, from a strategic or technical point of view, actions of an app developer to acquire users with high LTV, the probability of users that he or she will be acquiring, the probability will be high that the people will be bringing a lot of revenue.
Yeah, I mean, from a strategic point of view, I think it really just requires a lot of data and then a commitment to measuring and continuously optimizing. I mean, I think every app out there that's considering their marketing efforts should be working with an MMP to help them measure efficacy of their campaigns. Sharing data via that MMP with trusted partners, it allows platforms like ourselves and others to build lookalike models for those users. So by leveraging a lookalike model, you can fairly accurately predict the LTV of a new user that you've never seen before based on behavior of similar users that you provide to that platform. It is worth noting, though, I think that, LifeStreet's belief is that return on ad spend is the most important thing to optimize for in a successful campaign. By paying the right price for a user allows a campaign to scale more effectively. So an example is, some user may have $100 LTV in your app, and if you pay $80 for them, that's okay. That's a profitable buy.
Yeah.
And if a user has, a $1 LTV in that app and you end up paying 50 cents for them, that's also still a profitable buy. So through that lens, you can kind of acquire users at the right price across the different LTV spectrums.
Now, you mentioned the lookalike model. From your experience, starting with the point where you just launched your first user acquisition campaign, roughly speaking, just a ballpark, after what period of time you can actually build a lookalike model to see what is the broader spectrum of your app users? Are we talking about weeks, couple of months?
So for an existing app, we actually are doing that before we launch campaigns. So via the MMP, we're looking at unattributed install data and downstream event data to actually build that model so that on launch of the campaign, you're already able to layer on sort of value predictions.
Gotcha. So you know about the app, like the category, like you can calculate the probability of like not a probability, but how the user acquisition campaign will be working for that specific app, giving your previous experience of launching campaigns for similar apps before, and whether the user's pool is going to be getting the lookalike model will be based on this data.
Somewhat. Actually, that lookalike model is based entirely on that title's data.
Oh,
So, and that's, essentially it answers the question of, given an install, how much revenue do I expect this user to generate? We have other models that answer questions like, given an impression, how likely do I think this impression is going to turn into an install of this app? And those do have a learning curve when you launch a new campaign on the platform. So, despite having a LTV model or a lookalike model kind of out the gates, it does often take 4 to 6 weeks to really see that optimization take hold.
gotcha. Now let's assume we have an app and several user acquisition campaigns are being run, and we see that certain users generate a certain amount of revenue, and obviously we would like to increase the amount of revenue we're generating. How can app marketers increase LTV of that have been generated by their app users? What can you actually do?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think, whole sort of industries and books based on this kind of stuff. There's, I think the notion of testing everything and working on continuously improving that product. So, put in customer experience first, optimizing the onboarding flow, better retention mechanisms, things like that. That list is really, really long. But if you're talking about optimizing your marketing and UA strategy,
Yeah, that part.
it's absolutely worth trying to optimize and understand, are you getting the users in at the top of the funnel that have the highest likelihood of becoming high LTV users for that app?
Now, obviously, you've seen a lot of app user generation campaigns, app user acquisition campaigns, sorry. And probably you can pinpoint for me, in your experience, what app categories that it's really hard or even impossible to measure LTV for users for apps from those categories.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we're pretty fortunate in that we work with, primarily gaming companies, which is actually pretty direct. So things that you can measure directly in that app are pretty straightforward. That said, apps with like very sparse events can be really tough to measure LTV and to calculate LTV. Apps that drive offline conversions are obviously much more challenging to calculate in LTV. Generally speaking, we'd hope that there's some sort of proxy to help measure that, i.e. if you're CarMax or somebody, you might measure, request for test drives instead of actually understanding how many cars you actually sold from a campaign. But that said, it is just much easier for apps where all of the activity happens and is measurable in the app. It is worth noting, though, I think that there are, not necessarily categorically based, but there are times where LTV curves just change. So some of that could be seasonality. I mean, I think it's fair to say we've seen a bunch of that during the last couple of years, and I think are seeing it now, sort of, with the pandemic, or if sort of the economy changes out from under people, it's really important to be looking at that LTV curve and seeing if you need to make adjustments to those predictions, because that's all based obviously on historical data. And then if something changes going forward, that really, it's critical that that gets accounted for.
Now, your answer kind of nicely leads me to my next question, which is, as time goes by, do you find it becomes easier or harder to measure LTV for mobile app users? Because just like you said, a couple years of COVID, I bet so the models that were built before COVID had to be adapted, adjusted to be able to measure LTV in circumstances when people became, their habits changed, their lifestyle changed, they were forced to work from home, etc. So, in your estimate, how does the future looks like for marketers when it comes to measuring LTV for their users?
Yeah, I think it sure looks like it's becoming harder to measure LTV at the user level. I mean, I think you can look at SK Ad Network from Apple. It's just a good example of where there's a trade-off that's happening. In this case, the platform's making that trade-off, of granularity for increased user privacy. I'm sure that this trend is likely to continue, both sort of like regulatory pressure and platform pressure. Obviously, Apple has its own motivations there as well. They've certainly hurt Facebook along the way by doing that, which I don't think is an accident. It's definitely important to caveat that MMPs, mobile measurement providers, are continuing to work sort of, with and around, in some cases, these platforms to give as much insight into user values, sort of despite those restrictions. But, on a macro level, I think it's probably pretty safe to say that we're going to be looking a lot more at cohorts versus individual LTVs. And that's just a thing we'll all have to adapt to.
You mentioned iOS. What about Android? Is it better? Is it not so, desperate as it was with the iOS 14.5 released last year when people were just really in a state of panic? The Android side looks brighter.
I would say it does. I mean, we'll still see how that actually gets rolled out. But my suspicion is that will be a lot less of a chaotic transition. iOS 14.5, it was a whole shock to the industry and everything. I think we know a little bit more now of how to run campaigns without super granular data in cases. And I also suspect that Google is actually just going to execute that a little bit better than Apple did, but we'll see.
They're more cautious with advertising because this is the only money maker for them.
Exactly.
That's for Apple. They
Yeah.
have to be more cautious for sure. Okay. We actually finished the first part of the show, and here's the other one where we're not talking about the major topic at the table. Like in the first part, this is the kind of a personal touch, and when I'm in this part, I'm asking you just a few quick questions because I do want to let my audience know my guest a little bit better. Here we go. Question number one. What smartphone do you have now? And have you been switching between these two giants or staying one side all the time?
I picked my side pretty early on. So I've got a Pixel 6 Pro right now. I've been Android exclusively since I looked this up earlier, my first HTC Evo 4G. I'm on a MacBook right now, and I certainly use iOS devices for testing and market research and things like that. But as far as my daily use, entirely Android.
Gotcha, Android camp. Do you remember your first mobile phone, before smartphone era, those days?
I do. It was a Nokia phone that I got my freshman year of college. I think it was a 5110. I don't know if everyone remembers, but it's the one with all the customizable faceplates that you'd walk in the mall and see those kiosks selling all those different faceplates for those phones. I think it probably had Snake on it, but I'm not even sure.
Yeah, that was the thing, the major competitive advantage. Does the phone have a
Yep.
snake on it or not? Okay, back to the present. Imagine you've left your home and forgot your smartphone. It's sitting on your table. What would be the most missing feature for you when you're out?
I think it would probably be Google Maps, honestly. I've pretty much offloaded all of my directions in my brain now to my phone with Google Maps, so I might be a little bit lost without it. Second place would probably be WhatsApp, but I think navigation would be my first most missing feature.
Yeah, sci-fi writers, futurists are talking about singularity like something in the future, but in fact, smartphones is an extension of our brains these days already.
Totally.
Now, what new technologies could be hardware, software, you're thinking about when you're holding your smartphone and go like, wouldn't it be great if that thing can do this or that? What is missing?
You know, that's a good question, and I don't actually feel like I'm missing too much from my smartphone right now. I do, the trend of foldables to bigger displays is cool. Um, we haven't seen a bunch of strict innovation in the smartphone space, I would say, in the last number of years. It's been pretty iterative. That said, I make efforts to be pretty deliberate with my time. I don't always succeed, but so oftentimes I am sort of looking towards ways of making it a little bit less prominent in my life. Other sort of like emerging technologies that aren't necessarily app related, I am pretty interested in sort of the AR VR ecosystem that's kind of bubbling beneath the surface a little bit now and somewhat on the surface, and kind of seeing where that goes. And some of that certainly will be mobile related. I mean, we'll wait and see whether, Apple's future mixed reality device will end up using the phone or not. So a lot of exciting stuff happening there.
Yeah, just like it was unimaginable of so many people holding a small computer in their pocket all day long before smartphone era, and it's hard to imagine what's going to happen next. And are we ditching our smartphones in a few years or not? Because we're not ditching our computers by this point, and it's really hard to see what's going to happen with smartphone.
Yeah,
Hologram, Star Wars style, or not, or something not that fancy and funny, but just practical.
right.
Okay, before I let you go, just a very, very final question. How can people get in touch with you and get more information about you? What you do?
Yeah, happy to chat with people. The easiest way to get in touch with me is probably just to connect with me on LinkedIn. You can email me directly at levi.matkins@lifestreet.com as well. So happy to chat.
Terrific. Thank you for coming, Levi, and thanks for your time. Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Art.
And that was Levi Matkins, CEO at LifeStreet. To listen to more episodes, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts. Just search for Business of Apps and you will find us easily. We release episodes on Mondays, so subscribe and you'll be able to get new episodes on your smartphone, tablet, or computer as soon as we release them. And please don't forget to leave us a review or comment on iTunes. It is highly appreciated. And all episodes will also be available on businessofapps.com. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Business of Apps podcast. For more, head on over to businessofapps.com.